Tonight, we bring you a story based on real events and true beliefs about ghosts and the supernatural. These are unexplained occurrences that have been reported by real people. Please listen with an open mind and careful consideration. The Everglades didn't sleep. They merely shifted in the dark. Elias Thorne knew every mile of the stretch between Naples and Fort Lauderdale, but at 3 a.m, the road felt alien. The hum of his 18-wheeler was the only thing keeping the silence of the glades at bay. Outside, the sawgrass swayed in a phantom breeze, and the stagnant water of the canals reflected nothing but the void. He adjusted his cap, his eyes burning from hours of staring into the rhythmic strobe of dashed white lines. The radio had died miles back, replaced by a low-frequency hum that vibrated in his teeth. It wasn't just static. It sounded like a choir of cicadas screaming in unison, then abruptly cutting to dead silence. Elias reached for his thermos, but his hand froze halfway. A pale shimmer flickered in the rearview mirror. "Not tonight," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "Just let me get to the coast." The legend of the Midnight Ghost wasn't a secret among the veterans of the alley. Every driver had a story, a hitchhiker who vanished, a set of taillights that led into the black water, or a woman in a tattered sundress standing amidst the gators. Elias had always been a skeptic, a man of cold steel and diesel fumes. But as the temperature inside the cab plummeted, his breath hitched in a cloud of frost. A figure stood on the shoulder of the road, roughly 50 yards ahead. At 70 miles per hour, the distance closed in a heartbeat. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, her skin the color of bleached bone, wearing a dress that seemed to drift like smoke despite the humid air. Elias slammed his foot on the brake, the tires screaming against the heat-softened pavement. The trailer jackknifed slightly, the massive vehicle groaning under the sudden stress, before coming to a shuddering halt. Silence rushed back in, more deafening than the engine's roar. Elias sat in the sudden dark, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked out the passenger window. The shoulder was empty. The sawgrass was still. There were no footprints in the soft mud, no sign that anyone had been there. Yet the scent of jasmine and stagnant water filled the cab, cloying and sweet. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling. "Just a hallucination," he muttered, trying to convince the chill in his bones. "Just the highway hypnosis." Then a soft thud echoed from the roof of the cab. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. It was the deliberate, heavy press of a footstep. Elias looked up, his gaze fixed on the thin metal ceiling. Above him, something was moving. Slowly, with a rhythmic scraping of nails against steel, the weight shifted toward the windshield. A face slid into view, hanging upside down over the glass. Her eyes were not eyes at all, but swirling pools of swamp water, green and bottomless. She didn't scream, she didn't move. She simply stared through the laminate, her lips forming a silent word that Elias felt more than heard. "Return." The engine stalled out, the dashboard lights flickering once before dying completely. The Midnight Ghost had found her passenger, and the long road ahead had just become a dead end. Elias reached for the door handle, but his fingers felt like lead. The alley was hungry tonight, and he was the only thing on the menu. He closed his eyes, praying for the dawn.
He closed his eyes, praying for the dawn, but the dawn was an eternity away, buried beneath the thick canopy of cypress trees and the oppressive humidity of the Florida Everglades. The silence following the engine's expiration was heavier than the heat. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the cabin until Elias's lungs burned with every shallow breath. He waited for the shatter of glass or the icy touch of a phantom hand, but for a long moment, nothing came. There was only the frantic sound of his own pulse, a rhythmic drumbeat against the absolute stillness of the swamp. When he finally mustered the courage to open his eyes, the woman was no longer pressed against the glass. The space outside his window was empty, save for the swirling mist that clung to the asphalt like a damp shroud. He exhaled a ragged breath, his vision blurring. He needed to move. He needed to get off this stretch of I-75 before the darkness swallowed him whole. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning a ghostly white against the dark leather. He reached for the ignition, his fingers still sluggish and heavy, as if moving through invisible molasses. "Come on, baby," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Not here, not in this God-forsaken place." The key turned with a mechanical groan. The starter clicked, once, twice, but the engine refused to catch. On the third attempt, a low hum vibrated through the floorboards, not from the car, but from the earth itself. The swamp was waking up. From the black water, the guttural roar of a bull alligator echoed, a sound that felt like it was tearing through the night. Then he saw it in the rearview mirror, a flicker of movement. A pale light flickered deep in the brush near the edge. It was phosphorescent, a sickly green hue that pulsated like a dying heart. And in that light, she stood again, not by his door this time, but 50 yards back, standing in the center of the highway. Her dress, tattered and soaked with swamp water, hung limp against her skeletal frame. She was pointing, her finger, long and translucent, aimed directly at the black maw of the sawgrass. "Return," he whispered, the word tasting like copper. He remembered the old legends, stories of the hitchhiker who never reached the coast, carrying a secret the glades wouldn't let go. Elias looked at the passenger seat. There, resting on the floor mat, was the tarnished silver locket he'd found at the edge of the canal earlier that evening. He had picked it up on a whim, thinking it a lost trinket. A sudden thud rocked the car from behind. Elias bolted upright, his heart leaping. The rearview mirror was now obscured by a thick, wet film. Something was dragging itself over the trunk, the metal groaning under an impossible weight. He fumbled for his phone, but the screen remained black, the power drained by a force he couldn't explain. Elias realized that the dead end wasn't just a physical halt. It was the spiritual dead he had claimed when he took what belonged to the alley. He reached down, his hand trembling as he grasped the gold medal. The silver felt frozen, stinging his skin like ice. The woman's face suddenly reappeared at the windshield, distorted and agonizing. "Return it," she shrieked, the sound vibrating inside his skull. The glass began to spiderweb. Elias threw himself against the door, hoping the lock would give way before the darkness dragged him under.
Elias threw himself against the door, hoping the lock would give way before the darkness dragged him under. The latch finally groaned and snapped under the sheer force of his desperation, the momentum spilling him out onto the gritty asphalt of Alligator Alley. The humid air hit him like a heavy, wet blanket, yet the silver in his hand remained a shard of absolute zero. Behind him, his windshield imploded, showering the interior with crystalline shards that hummed with a terrifying spectral frequency. He scrambled away, his hands and knees scraping against the coarse road. The woman's shriek lingered in the air, a vibrating resonance that turned the swamp's natural chorus of crickets and bullfrogs into an eerie silence. He looked back and saw her, a shimmering, tattered figure composed of marsh mist, hovering over the hood of his abandoned car. Her eyes were hollow pits filled with stagnant swamp water, and her outstretched hand pointed directly at the silver piece he clutched. "It wasn't yours, Elias," a voice whispered, though it didn't hum from her translucent lips. It rose from the black water of the canal running parallel to the alley. He struggled to his feet, his legs feeling like leaden weights. The silver was an impossible burden now, pulling his arm downward as if gravity itself had a vendetta against his thievery. He remembered the hidden, crumbling graveyard he had stumbled upon deep within the sawgrass, the one not marked on any modern map. He had mistakenly thought the silver was a forgotten relic, a simple prize for a lucky scavenger. Now he realized it was an ancient anchor for a soul that refused to drift away into the afterlife. The ghost drifted forward, her feet never touching the pavement. Every phantom step she took brought a wave of suffocating cold that withered the tall grass at the roadside. Elias turned and ran, not toward the safety of the distant city lights, but toward the dark, jagged line of the cypress trees. The highway was no longer an escape route. It had become a stage for his judgment. His boots splashed into the thick muck of the marsh. The pungent smell of sulfur and decaying vegetation filled his lungs, nearly choking him. He reached a gnarled cypress knee and stopped, gasping for air. The silver began to glow with a sickly, pale luminescence, illuminating the murky water at his feet. Below the surface, he saw faces, dozens of them, pale and wide-eyed, trapped eternally beneath the shifting silt. They weren't ghosts like the woman. They were the alley's previous guests who had foolishly tried to keep what they found. "Return it to the stone," the woman commanded, her voice now a rumble like distant thunder. She appeared 10 feet away, her form flickering like a dying flame. He looked at the silver. It was an ornate compass, its needle spinning wildly, pointing not north, but down into the dark, hungry heart of the marsh. He saw a stone plinth rising from the water, carved with names long eroded by time. To reach it, he would have to wade into the chest-deep blackness, where alligators watched with glowing amber eyes. The pressure in his chest tightened as the woman raised her hand, the air solidifying into a crushing, suffocating grip. He had no choice but to step into the water, the silver guiding him toward a grave that felt far too much like his own.
He stepped into the water, the blackness rising to his chest as his boots sank into the thick, anaerobic silt of the swamp floor. The liquid was surprisingly cold, a shroud that seemed to sap the heat directly from his marrow. Every ripple he created felt like an invitation, a dinner bell rung for the predators circling just beyond the reach of the silver light. The amber eyes of the alligators remained motionless, yet he could feel their primal hunger pressing against his skin like a physical weight. The woman's grip on the air did not relent. It grew heavier, a crushing density that forced the breath from his lungs in ragged, shallow gasps. She drifted above the surface, her tattered dress trailing in the dark water like shredded moss. She didn't speak, but her presence was a scream in the back of his mind, a demand for justice, or perhaps just for company in her eternal solitude. He watched her eyes, which were not amber like the beast's, but a hollow, weeping gray. With every agonizing step, the stone plinth grew larger, a monolith of weathered granite that defied the natural decay of the marsh. As he drew closer, the silver light intensified, illuminating the carvings he had seen from the bank. These weren't just names, they were warnings. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the slimy, lichen-covered surface. The stone was unnaturally warm, pulsing with a rhythmic thrum that echoed the frantic beating of his own heart, a heartbeat the swamp seemed eager to stop. "Who are they?" he wheezed, the words barely audible over the chorus of cicadas and the distant thrum of traffic from Alligator Alley. The woman descended, her feet hovering inches above the surface. The silver radiance surrounding her shifted, turning a bruised, angry violet. She pointed a translucent finger toward a specific name at the base of the plinth, one that appeared fresher than the others, as if the moss had been recently scraped away by desperate nails. He leaned in, squinting through the gloom. The name etched there was his own. Panic flared, hot and sharp, but before he could recoil, a sudden movement beneath the water caught his eye. A pale, skeletal hand shot out from the muck, gripping his ankle with a strength that surpassed anything human. He was dragged downward, his face plunging into the foul-tasting water before he could draw a final breath. Beneath the surface, the world was a blur of silt and shadows. The silver light followed him down, revealing a hidden chamber beneath the roots of a massive submerged cypress tree. It wasn't just a grave, it was an altar. The skeletal hand belonged to a corpse that looked exactly like the man he had seen in the old photographs at the local diner, the man who had vanished on the alley 40 years ago. The ghost woman was there too, her form shimmering in the underwater gloom. She wasn't holding him down anymore. She was pointing deeper into the submerged cavern, toward a rusted iron lockbox wedged into the limestone. The pressure in his chest shifted to an internal explosion of urgency. He realized then that the silver wasn't a guide to his death, but a key to a secret the swamp had been trying to swallow for decades. He lunged for the box, his fingers scraping the cold metal, knowing that inside lay the truth about the woman and the lost souls of Alligator Alley. He lunged for the box, his fingers scraping the cold metal, knowing that inside lay the truth about the woman and the lost souls of Alligator Alley.
His heart was pounding in his ears, and his lungs screamed for oxygen, a burning sensation radiating from his chest, yet the weight of the iron held him anchored to the silty cavern floor. With a desperate heave, he wrenched the object from its limestone cradle, stirring up ancient sediment that blinded him. The ghostly figure, the woman of silver and shadows, didn't flee. She hovered in the murk, her hair drifting like willow branches in an underwater storm. She placed a translucent hand over his own to steady his frantic movements. Her eyes pulsed with a silent command: carry it to the light. Kicking against the jagged floor, Elias propelled himself upward, the box clutched against his chest. The surface of the pool felt miles away for a man whose breath had long since expired. The iron was a leaden weight, dragging his muscles toward the dark, but adrenaline acted as a buoy. When he finally broke the surface, the humid swamp air tasted like rot, yet to him it was nectar. He hauled himself onto the muddy bank, the lockbox clattering against a gnarled cypress knee. He lay there gasping, his heart hammering like a trapped bird. The midnight silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic thrum of insects and the low croak of a bullfrog. He turned his gaze toward the water. She was there, standing waist-deep in the sawgrass, her form shimmering with ethereal radiance. She was no longer a terrifying specter, but a silent guardian of a history the Glades had tried to digest for 70 years. Elias reached for his flashlight, its beam cutting the humidity to illuminate the heavy box. The rust was thick, a jagged crust of decades, but as he wiped away the slime, he saw a faded emblem etched into the lid, a seal belonging to a defunct drainage company from the 1940s. His hands shook as he took a stone and began to strike the corroded latch. Each blow echoed through the cypress stands, a metallic clanging that felt like a summons. With an agonizing groan, the lock snapped. Elias pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in rotting oilcloth, were stacks of water-stained ledgers and tarnished jewelry, but beneath the valuables lay something far more haunting, a series of handwritten letters and a single cracked photograph. He picked up the photo, the image sepia-toned and brittle. It depicted laborers standing before a half-constructed bridge, their smiles wide despite the sun. In the center stood the woman, her hair pinned back, looking exactly as she did now, though full of life and color. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a story of a haunting. It was a record of a mass disappearance that the history books had scrubbed clean. The woman wasn't just a ghost. She was the last witness to a betrayal that had turned this stretch of Everglades into a secret graveyard. As he looked back toward the reeds, she inclined her head in a slow, mournful nod before she vanished into the rising mist, leaving Elias alone with the burden of the truth, the weight of the box, and a destiny forever changed by the secrets of Alligator Alley. Elias stood alone with the burden of the truth, the weight of the box, and a destiny forever changed by the secrets of Alligator Alley. He gripped the rusted handle of the container, his knuckles white against the dark, corroded metal. The silence that followed the woman's disappearance was deafening, broken only by the guttural croaking of bullfrogs and the distant, lonely hum of a late-night semi-truck navigating the far end of the desolate toll road. He didn't wait for the mist to fully reclaim the spot where the specter had stood. He turned and waded back towards his parked truck, his boots squelching in the thick, unforgiving muck. Every shadow shifting among the cypress knees looked like a lurking figure, and every splash in the dark water sounded like a pursuit from something unseen. Once inside the cramped cab, he locked the doors with a frantic click and flipped on the dome light. The interior of the truck felt like a fragile sanctuary against the ancient, humid darkness pressing in from the Everglades. He placed the heavy box on the passenger seat and took a ragged, uneven breath, the scent of sulfur and rot still clinging to his clothes. His hands trembled as he pried the lid open. The screech of the rusted hinges was a piercing sound in the quiet night, vibrating through his very teeth. Inside, protected by a tattered layer of rotted oilcloth, lay a stack of water-damaged ledgers and a handful of silver nitrate photographs. He picked one up, handling the brittle edge with care. It showed a small, thriving community. Wooden shacks were built on sturdy stilts. Children were playing in a sun-drenched clearing, and a group of men stood proudly in front of a modest sawmill. This was the lost settlement of Cypress Landing, a place that appeared on no modern map and lived in no official history. As he flipped through the damp pages of the ledgers, the scope of the betrayal became sickeningly clear. These weren't just records of daily life, they were original land deeds.
The signatures at the bottom of the transfer documents were blatant forgeries, a systematic theft orchestrated by the powerful development company that had paved the way for the road's construction in the late 60s. Elias recognized the names with a jolt of ice in his veins. The descendants of those corrupt developers were now prominent senators, high-ranking judges, and real estate moguls who dictated the state's political future. The mass disappearance wasn't a tragic accident. To make way for the asphalt artery of the South, the inhabitants of Cypress Landing had been forcibly evicted or systematically silenced. A typed litter tucked into the back of a ledger detailed a clearing operation that had taken place under the cover of a massive staged swamp fire. The ghost wasn't just seeking a final rest. She was demanding justice for a community erased from human memory to satisfy the insatiable greed of progress. God, Elias whispered, the word catching in his throat. He realized why his grandfather had been so haunted by his time working on the road crews. He hadn't just been building a highway. He had been a silent, terrified witness to a massacre buried in the swamp mud. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light filled his rearview mirror. A black SUV had pulled up silently behind him, its high beams cutting through the gloom. Elias squinted, his heart hammering. A man stepped out, his silhouette tall. The secret of Alligator Alley was no longer hidden, and danger had arrived.
Danger had arrived in the form of a man whose shadow stretched long and jagged across the asphalt, illuminated by the harsh glare of the SUV's high beams. Elias gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, his breath hitching in his chest. The man approached the driver's side window with a slow, predatory confidence, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel shoulder with a deliberate rhythm that mirrored the thumping of Elias's heart. Elias rolled down the window just a crack, allowing the heavy, humid air of the Everglades to rush in. It smelled of stagnant water, diesel, and something else, something metallic and ancient. The stranger leaned down, his face partially obscured by a tactical cap pulled low over his brow. His eyes were sharp and cold, the color of flint. "You have something that doesn't belong to you, Elias," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate against the glass. "That old journal has caused enough grief for one family. It's time to let the past stay buried where it belongs." Elias felt the weight of his grandfather's leather-bound notebook on the passenger seat. It felt like a lead weight, charged with the energy of 1,000 untold stories. "My grandfather was a witness," Elias countered, his voice shaking despite his efforts to remain steady. "He saw the men your employers worked to death and discarded like refuse in the muck. You can't hide a graveyard this large forever." The man's lips curled into a worthless smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "We've managed for 70 years. One curious grandson isn't going to change the landscape of Florida's history." He reached for the door handle, but the sharp click of the locks echoing in the silence of the night stopped him. Suddenly, the temperature inside the truck plummeted. A thick, unnatural fog began to roll off the black water of the canal, swirling around the SUV like grasping fingers. From the depths of the sawgrass, a low, mournful moan echoed, a sound that wasn't the wind or a predator, but a chorus of voices lost to time. The man in the cap stiffened, his gaze shifting toward the dark waterline where the reeds were parting. "They don't want you here," Elias whispered, sensing a sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. The Midnight Ghost wasn't just a legend or a singular entity. It was the collective memory of the souls buried beneath the asphalt they stood upon. A pale, shimmering figure emerged from the mist, standing directly behind the black SUV. It was a man in tattered rags, his limbs elongated, and his eyes burning with a cold blue fire. More figures followed, rising slowly from the swamp, their translucent forms shimmering against the darkness. The man from the SUV stepped back, his hand reaching for a holster at his hip, but his bravado was visibly crumbling. "What is this?" he barked, though his voice lacked conviction. He fired a shot into the mist, the crack of the gun echoing through the empty corridor of the highway, but the bullet passed harmlessly through the leading spirit. Elias slammed the truck into gear. He fishtailed around the SUV, the headlights illuminating a dozen more spirits lining the road. As he sped away, Elias glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was engulfed by the fog, his silhouette disappearing as the spectral crowd closed in.
The secret was screaming to be told, and Elias was the only one left to speak for the dead.
Elias was the only one left to speak for the dead, and the weight of that responsibility pressed against his ribs as he shoved the accelerator to the floorboards. The engine of his old Ford roared in a desperate protest against the encroaching silence of the Everglades. Behind him, the rearview mirror was a blur of mist, but the image of Vance being swallowed by spirits remained seared into his retinas. The alley had its own brand of justice. He knew now the ghosts didn't want blood. They wanted acknowledgement. The sawgrass seemed to lean inward, reaching out with razor-edged fingers. The fog was turning a bruised shade of violet under the moonless sky. Elias reached for the satchel he'd recovered from the submerged pump station. Inside lay the damp ledger containing the names of the men and women who had vanished during the Great Land Boom. It was a map of a mass grave hidden beneath the road, a secret buried by greed and paved over by progress. Every few miles, a figure would appear on the shoulder, a woman in a tattered hat, a man holding a rusted shovel, a child with eyes like hollowed stars. They didn't move toward him. They simply watched, their translucent bodies flickering like dying candles as his headlights cut through them. They were waiting to see if he would keep his unspoken promise. He was the courier for a century of suppressed grief, carrying 1,000 lost souls toward Naples. He checked his phone. No signal. The GPS was a useless loop of recalculating, as if the satellites couldn't find this haunted stretch of Earth. His chest tightened with a sudden, suffocating panic. If the truck broke down now, he would be just another story told at roadside diners. He glanced at the gas gauge. The needle was hovering dangerously close to the red line. He hadn't realized how much fuel he'd burned while idling at the ruins. "Just a few more miles," he whispered, his voice thin in the cramped cabin. "I'm taking you home, I promise. I'm going to tell them everything." As he approached the bridge, the air temperature plummeted. Frost blossomed on the windshield, obscuring his vision. Elias flipped the wipers on high, the blades screeching against the ice. Through the rhythmic swipes, he saw them. Dozens of them. They weren't on the shoulder anymore. They were standing in the center of the lane, a wall of shimmering, sorrowful light. Elias didn't brake. If he stopped, the cold would take him, just as it had claimed Vance. He gripped the wheel and drove straight into the heart of the congregation. Instead of an impact, he passed through a veil of freezing water, the cabin filled with the scent of swamp muck. Voices whispered a single word in unison, vibrating through the metal. "Remember." The wall of spirits parted. And as he broke through to the clear air beyond, the fog began to thin. The distant orange glow of city lights finally shimmered on the horizon, cutting through the darkness. He was out of the alley, but the ledger on the passenger seat felt heavier than ever, a physical debt owed to the restless shadows. He reached the first street lamp, yet the silence of the truck was gone, replaced forever by the persistent, ghostly hum of the names he now carried for the world to hear. The names he now carried for the world to hear vibrated through the steering wheel, a rhythmic thrumming that echoed his own racing pulse. Elias tightened his grip, his knuckles white against the worn leather, as the first suburban crossroads appeared. The neon sign of a 24-hour diner flickered in the distance, the Silver Spoon, a beacon of mundane reality in a world that had become impossibly thin. He pulled the rig into the gravel lot, the heavy engine sighing like a dying beast as he cut the ignition. Silence did not follow. Instead, the cabin remained filled with the soft, overlapping whispers of 1,000 voices, each one a thread in the tapestry of the alley's forgotten history. He reached for the ledger. It wasn't just paper and ink anymore. The leather cover felt warm, pulsing with a low-frequency energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. Every name he had seen, Sarah, Miller, Tallow, Ben, demanded acknowledgement. He remembered the spectral figures on the asphalt, eyes begging for recognition. He stepped out into the humid Florida night, the air smelling of swamp water and diesel.
Inside the diner, a lone waitress was wiping down the counter. Her name tag read Martha. As Elias walked in, the ledger tucked under his arm, the bell above the door chimed with a dissonant, metallic ring that sounded like a funeral knell. Martha looked up, her eyes widening as she took in his disheveled appearance. Elias knew he looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave, his clothes stained with residue of the ghost fog. "Coffee," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign even to himself, thick with the grit of the road. He sat in a corner booth, the ledger placed squarely on the Formica tabletop. He opened it, and the whispers grew into a frantic chorus, a cacophony of pleas for peace. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number he had memorized years ago. It belonged to Julian Vance, a man who dealt in the types of truths that newspapers refused to print. Vance was an archivist of the anomalous, a keeper of the state's darkest, most discarded secrets. "Julian," Elias whispered when the line clicked open. "I have it. The ledger of the alley. Every soul that the asphalt swallowed since '68. They aren't just shadows anymore." On the other end, there was a sharp, audible intake of breath. Julian knew the legends, but nobody had ever returned from the deepest fog of the midnight stretch with physical proof. As Elias spoke, the lights in the diner began to flicker in time with the humming names. Martha dropped a ceramic mug, and it shattered, the white pieces skittering across the floor like bone fragments. The shadows in the corners of the room lengthened, reaching toward the ledger as if trying to reclaim what had been stolen from the dark. Elias realized then that the debt wasn't just about telling the stories. It was about releasing them into the ether where the fog couldn't reach. The ghost of the Midnight Rider hadn't just given him a book. He had given him a key to a metaphysical prison. He looked out the window, seeing a familiar, unnatural mist curling around his truck's tires, even here, miles from the marsh. The alley wasn't finished with him. He had to reach the high-frequency transmitter at the old WXPL radio tower before the first light of dawn, or the names would fade back into the mist forever, taking him with them.
He refused to let the mist take him with them. He slammed the truck into gear, the engine roaring in defiance of the silence that usually smothered the Florida swamplands. The mist wasn't just following, it was gaining, tendrils like spectral fingers weaving through the wheel wells. Every mile toward the WXPL tower felt like dragging the truck through deep water. The book sat on the passenger seat, pulsing with a rhythmic bioluminescent light that matched the frantic beating of his own heart. Each name etched into those yellowed pages represented a soul tethered to the alley, a ledger of the lost that needed to be balanced before the sun broke the horizon. The tower appeared through the haze, a rusted monument to a forgotten era of broadcasting. He skidded to a halt at the base, the unnatural fog already pooling around the cabin doors, thick enough to muffle the sound of his heavy breathing. He grabbed the book and bolted toward the service ladder, his boots clanging against the iron rungs. The air grew colder as he climbed, the temperature dropping with every foot of elevation until his breath puffed in white plumes. Below him, the marsh was a sea of shifting gray, a hungry maw waiting for the clock to strike dawn. At the summit, the high-frequency transmitter hummed with a dormant energy. He fumbled with the ancient controls, his fingers numb. He hadn't just brought a book, he had brought a frequency. He laid the open pages against the copper induction coil, and the text began to bleed off the paper, turning into streams of pure golden light. He patched the signal into the main array. "Hear them," he whispered into the cold wind. "Let them go." The Midnight Rider appeared then, standing on the narrow platform beside him. The ghost's eyes weren't hollow pits of terror anymore, but weary lanterns seeking rest. The transmission flared. A screeching static tore through the air, vibrating the very marrow of his bones. Suddenly, the names began to broadcast, not as sound, but as a psychic shockwave that rippled across the Everglades. One by one, the specters that had haunted the asphalt of Alligator Alley for decades began to dissolve, their shimmering forms drawn upward into the transmitter and shot out into the infinite sky. The mist below began to boil, retreating from the tower like a tide being pulled back by an unseen moon. The oppressive weight that had settled over the region since the rider's first appearance finally began to lift. In the distance, a thin, bruised line of violet appeared on the eastern horizon. The rider looked at him, gave a solemn nod of gratitude, and then he too began to scatter into embers of pale light, caught in the slipstream of the broadcast. As the first true ray of sunlight pierced the dark, the book in his hands turned to fine gray ash, blowing away in the morning breeze.
The transmitter fell silent, its work finished. He leaned against the railing, watching the natural fog of the morning, mundane and harmless, settle over the grass. The metaphysical prison was empty. The alley was just a road again, long and lonely, but no longer hungry. He climbed down the ladder, his legs shaking from the adrenaline. For the first time in years, the silence of the marsh didn't feel like a threat. It felt like peace. He walked back to his truck, the engine ticking as it cooled, and drove toward the sunrise, leaving the ghosts behind.
Thank you so much for listening to today's horror story. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. There are many more terrifying stories coming soon. Thank you for supporting Horror Podcast, English Horror Stories.